Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to talk about a book in the e-book for translating the New Testament. This book, or this volume in the series, is translating the book of Colossians, clause by clause, written by Adam Copenhaver, who is pastor of Mapton Grace Brethren Church in Washington State. And he's here to tell us a little something about this book he's authored. Adam, welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about this volume that you've authored, translating the book of Colossians, clause by clause. How does this book break out?
Yeah, the book has 3 sections, and it's really intended to be a guide to help somebody walk through translating Colossians. So there's an introduction first, and in the introduction we look at the system of how we're going to translate Colossians and how we'll distinguish clauses and independent clauses from dependent clauses. Some of the types of clauses that are in Colossians and some of the features of the text of Colossians. So that's in the introduction. Then there's a section that's more or less a workbook where the Greek text is there for a student to look through and try to identify where the verbs are in the Greek text, and then some diagrams for translating. They're just the Greek diagrams with blank space to work that out. And then the third section is essentially an answer key where I've written up how I've explained the text and how I've made my translation decisions and how the clauses work together from one to the next. And we go through especially the verbal elements and look at each verb and how it's functioning and how it relates to the other verbs around it, syntax and so forth. And then some other key features, some key words to consider, and some of the structural markers and so on in the text. So the third section really walks a student through. So you get a chance to try it out for yourself in the second section, see how you can do, and then look to the third section for some help and some tips along the way, and then for my explanation of how I've worked through Colossians and through the text.
All right. Well, let me piggyback on something that you've said about moving on tips. You talked about tips in the answer key that explained your rendering and the way you see the flow of thought unfolding in Colossians. Do you give us any tips in the beginning on some things that we might focus on that help me as a translator before I even get to that second section? Are there any tips you might render to me?
Yeah, in the opening introduction, there are some general tips for how to identify those verbs and verbal elements and what they might look like in the text of Colossians and how that works. And then also there's a little bit of discussion of some of the particular features in Colossians. Colossians is known for having some unique vocabulary, and so we look at some of the unique vocabulary and what kind of words we'll run into that are unique to Colossians. Colossians also has some features. It has some run-on sentences, and so we'll prepare ourselves for that. For especially in chapter 1, there's 11 verses. That's one long sentence of continual dependent clauses, each dependent on the previous clause, and increasingly dependent clauses, and so it gets quite complex. So we want to be prepared for those kinds of features, and some of the relative pronouns and the way some of those work. So we try to prepare and be prepared as we enter the text for what we're going to encounter when we get to the text.
Well, that sounds fantastic, especially since most English translations are going to take those huge sentences and break them down into nice little English translation sentences, and a lot of interpretation going on there, and you don't even know it. This is going to give you some hands-on opportunity to see it for yourself and work your way through it.
That's exactly right. To make a good English translation, we don't like run-on sentences with 23 consecutive commas. And maybe it's not even good Greek, but it's there, and that's the way that Paul wrote. So, for example, the Christ hymn in verses 15 through 20 of chapter 1 is very important to the book of Colossians, but the whole thing starts with a relative pronoun, looking back to the Son. It doesn't start as an independent sentence. But to render it in a way that's sensible in English, of course, we need to find breaks and places to make some sentences, and even paragraph breaks in what's really just one long sentence. So trying to trace Paul's thought through all of that requires that we see how all of that works and how these are really dependent clauses, all part of one long sentence.
Very good. Well, great. Well, let me ask you this. In some ways, I think you've already answered this question, but let's restatement isn't a bad thing for someone who preaches and teaches on a regular basis. So let me go ahead and ask a question that you may have already answered, but let's maybe reframe it. How might this work be helpful? How might your book be helpful to me as a student or pastor for preaching and teaching? How might you answer that question?
Yeah, I think the book is really helpful for trying to follow Paul's train of thought. That's, to me, what I think is the most helpful aspect of that book when you're trying to put together how one phrase leads into the next and how one clause is connected to the other clauses and how that gets Paul from where he starts to where he's going and where his mind is traveling. It's a really helpful way to follow his train of thought that way and to see it laid out. And so that's what the phrasing style of diagrams really do for you, is help you to see how it lays out and how his thoughts connect together and where there's repetition and where he's recalling and moving back to things and how he's building and piecing together the argument. So it's really helpful in that sense.
No, fantastic. So, all right. So, as a pastor, as a teacher, if I were to purchase this book and work my way through Colossians and really get into the text, is this all I need? Would you see this as a supplement to commentaries? Is it a commentary? Tell me a little bit. How might you distinguish your work from a commentary, and what perhaps commentaries might you recommend to supplement this work?
Yeah. So what this book does for a pastor student who's engaging Colossians and wanting to understand the text, and then to be able to perhaps preach it or to teach it, this book enters into that process early in the process. So I'm a pastor. I preach on a weekly basis, and the way that this kind of work and this book would enter into my sermon process is I start off by generally reading the text in English first, because I want to have the text have an initial impression upon me in the same way it'll have an initial impression upon my congregation when they first read or hear it in English. But then from there I enter into my deeper study. I take some notes based on just that first initial reading in English. Then I want to engage the Greek text. I want to get behind the English translation and see what's going on and how things flow. And that's where this book will really come in helpful. In my own study, whatever text I'm on, I take the Greek text and I lay it out in basically the way this book lays out the text, and following the verbs and following the phrasing and dependent clauses and so on. And so then that really helps me figure out where the train of thought is. That helps me develop my outline and know where the main points are. It helps me get to the main point and how I'm going to begin thinking about the text and structuring it in my mind, how that'll lead to the structure of the message. Then from there, I want to know what other people can help me out with. So this book would help me in that step of laying out the phrasing and so on. And in the answer key, if you use the third section of the book, I do include some commentary. The Greek and the grammar gets pretty boring pretty fast. If you're writing or if you're reading, it's nice to spice it up with a little theological thought here or there, a little practical insight. And so there's a little sprinkling of that in there just for fun. But then to really get into more of the historical context and more of the theological implications and so on, that's where then the commentaries come in and are really helpful. And there are some good commentaries on Colossians. There are a lot of good commentaries on Colossians, actually. When people ask me what commentary should I buy, I'm getting ready to preach on Colossians, I generally say that the first two that are most helpful, at least for me, being fair and reasonable and centered on the key issues. The first would be N.T. Wright's volume in the Tyndale New Testament Commentary series. And it's a smaller volume, so it's a quick way to get a quick orientation to some of the issues in the text. And then Doug Moo has a very good commentary in the Pillar Commentaries series. And he does a good job. He's a little more detailed, a little more thorough on exploring different sides of issues, but he does a good job of exploring multiple sides of issues and being pretty fair and reasonable in how he then comes to his own conclusions. So I find those two to be pretty helpful. Then if you really want to get creative, I don't know if anybody else reads this kind of stuff, but if you want to get immersed into the first century world of Colossae a little bit, there's some interesting historical volumes that can be purchased. One that I find to be very interesting is by I don't know if I'm going to say the name right, but somebody whose last name is Ritti, R-I-T-T-I, and it's an epigraphic guide to some inscriptions in Hierapolis, and you can look it up on Amazon or wherever and find that. And it's a really good way to get right into the primary historical material of the first century and see what kinds of Hierapolis being next door to Colossae, and see what kinds of things were going on historically in the inscriptions that they've found in Hierapolis. So that's a really interesting volume, very unusual compared to a commentary, but a very interesting volume to read alongside commentaries and try to understand that first century world.
Well, very good. Well, Adam, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us this book that you've authored, translating the book of Colossians, clause by clause.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to work on it, and I hope it's helpful to a lot of people.
Well, good. I trust that as you plan your preaching schedule or teaching schedule, you'll take advantage of maybe checking out Adam's book on translating Colossians clause by clause. In the meantime, I trust you will have a great day.